My future mother-in-law raised her champagne glass slowly and looked directly at me across the candlelight. The smile on her face was perfect. The warmth behind it was not there at all. Vanessa Calloway tilted her head slightly, the way women do when they have decided something and are now enjoying the delivery, and said, "Well, we always imagined Nathan would choose someone a little more accomplished." Soft laughter moved around the table. Not uncomfortable laughter. The kind that happens when a room has already decided whose side it is on. Her sister leaned toward the woman beside her and said, not quietly enough, "She means refined." Another ripple of amusement. I smiled and folded my hands in my lap. Then Vanessa looked at my dress. Simple black silk, minimal jewelry, the look of someone who has nothing to prove to strangers. She gave the small, final smile of a person who believes they have already measured you and found the measurement satisfying. "Ordinary girls sometimes make the best wives," she said. "Less complicated." Nathan shifted beside me. I felt him about to speak. Then her phone rang. She glanced at it, mildly irritated, and answered right there at the table the way people answer calls when they believe their time is more important than the room they are in. Her expression stayed irritated for about 4 seconds. Then it changed. The irritation became confusion. The confusion became something I had no word for yet. Her posture shifted. Her free hand moved to the table and rested there with the specific stillness of someone who needs to anchor themselves. She looked up at me once, then a second time, longer. The voice on the other end kept talking. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the polished precision she had been using all evening. "How?" she said quietly. "How is this possible?" Every person at that table heard it, and every person at that table turned to look at me. That was the moment Vanessa Calloway understood who she had been speaking to. The problem was she had already said everything she intended to say. Some people only discover your worth after they find your name attached to money. The unfortunate part for them is that by then, the room has already heard everything else. If you enjoy stories where the truth arrives quietly and lands permanently, you are in the right place. Subscribe to Revenge Cold Stories before we go any further, and tell me your first name and your city in the comments. I want to know who is sitting with me tonight. Now let me take you back to where this actually started. My name is Mara. I am 31 years old. I grew up in a family that did not have a great deal of money and did not spend much time discussing the fact. My father was an engineer. My mother taught middle school mathematics for 22 years. We were comfortable in the specific way of people who have enough and have never needed more than enough to feel secure. I built my first software product at 22 in the spare bedroom of an apartment I shared with 2 other people. It was a logistics coordination platform for mid-size freight companies, and it was not glamorous work, and it did not produce immediate results. And for the first 3 years, the primary emotion associated with it was the specific exhaustion of someone who is doing something that has not yet proven it will work. By the time I was 27, it had proven itself. By 29, I had restructured the company into a holding entity, brought in 2 institutional investors, and renamed it Ellington Global Ventures. The logistics platform was one division of 4. The company's total asset valuation by the time of my engagement dinner placed it comfortably in the range that made certain phone calls get answered quickly and certain decisions get deferred to my signature. I did not talk about this at dinner parties, not from false modesty, from the understanding, developed over years of building something real, that the people who need to know already know, and the people who don't know don't need to. And advertising yourself to strangers is a form of insecurity dressed as confidence. This was apparently illegible to Vanessa Calloway. Nathan and I met at a conference in Atlanta 18 months before the engagement dinner. He was presenting on commercial real estate development, and I was attending a panel on logistics infrastructure, and we ended up at the same dinner table afterward and talked for 3 hours without either of us noticing how much time had passed. He was honest with me about his family early in the relationship, not apologetically, just clearly, the way someone describes weather in a city they grew up in. His mother was socially ambitious and image-conscious and had spent 30 years building a position in Charleston's old money-adjacent social architecture. His father was quieter, more reasonable, somewhat worn down by proximity to the performance. Nathan said, "She will try to figure out where you rank. She does it with everyone." I said I could handle that. He said, "I know you can. I just want you to know it's coming." The first dinner I had with his family was 4 months into the relationship. Casual, ostensibly. A Sunday lunch at the family home in Mount Pleasant. The house was the kind that communicates history and maintenance and the specific message that the people inside it have always been the kind of people who live in houses like this. Vanessa greeted me warmly at the door. The warmth lasted approximately 15 minutes before the questions began. They were conversational in packaging. Where had I grown up? Where had my family vacationed? What did my father do? The questions of someone conducting an intake assessment while performing a social call. I answered straightforwardly without elaborating. My father was an engineer. We vacationed at the coast when I was young. I worked in technology and logistics. Technology and logistics landed without producing any visible impression, which was fine. I was not there to produce an impression. But I watched Vanessa file me under a category. I could see the categorization happening in real time. The way experienced observers can see people making decisions they are not aware they are making. The category she assigned me was pleasant enough, polite, adequately presentable, not threatening, not remarkable, not what she had imagined for Nathan. Over the following months, this category expressed itself in the texture of every interaction. She praised Brianna, Nathan's younger brother's fiancée, consistently and specifically. Brianna's father owned luxury dealerships across 3 states, and Vanessa referenced this fact with the frequency of someone who finds visible financial credentials genuinely reassuring. She asked Brianna's opinions on event planning and interior design and social calendars. She asked my opinions rarely, and when she did, the questions had a quality of politeness that was really a form of not asking at all. I was present. I was managed. I was not considered. Nathan noticed. He apologized for it more than once in the way people apologize for weather they cannot control. I told him it was fine and meant it, not because the behavior was acceptable, but because my estimation of myself was not dependent on Vanessa Calloway's estimation of me, and spending emotional energy on her assessment would have been a poor allocation. The engagement dinner was Vanessa's production entirely. She chose the restaurant, a private waterfront venue in Charleston that communicated exactly the level of occasion she wanted communicated. She organized the seating, she planned the toasts, she curated the guest list with the precision of someone who understands that the audience for a performance matters as much as the performance itself. Nathan had proposed 3 weeks earlier on a quiet evening at home. No audience, no orchestrated moment, just the 2 of us and a question and an answer and a bottle of wine we had been saving for something worth celebrating. Vanessa had been mildly disappointed by the absence of a public proposal. She had, apparently, been expecting something she could photograph. The engagement dinner was her correction. I wore the black silk dress because I liked it, and because it was appropriate for the venue, and because I had never used clothing as a statement and saw no reason to start. Nathan wore a dark suit. Vanessa arrived in a structured ivory dress that communicated effort and occasion simultaneously, and she moved through the room with the specific ease of someone operating on home territory. The early part of the dinner was the performance at its most controlled. Toasts were given, wine was poured, the food was excellent. Vanessa was charming in the public-facing way she was always charming when the audience was present and the occasion required it. The shift began subtly around the second course. She asked whether I planned to keep working after marriage. The question was framed as interest. Underneath it was an assumption that my working was a minor thing that might reasonably be set aside when more important domestic considerations arose. I said I expected to continue working. Yes, she said, Nathan's lifestyle can be difficult for some women to keep up with financially. Her friends smiled into their glasses. I looked at her pleasantly and said nothing. The nothing seemed to frustrate her slightly, which told me she had expected a defensive response. Defensiveness gives a certain kind of person material to work with. My lack of it removed the material and left her with only her own words in the air. Then came background, that one word, delivered with the specific precision of someone who knows exactly what it means and is testing whether you do too. The table went quiet after it. Not dramatically. Just the particular quiet that follows a line everyone heard and nobody wants to acknowledge having heard. Nathan looked at her. His father looked at his wine. I looked at Vanessa and smiled the smile of someone who is watching a situation develop and is in no hurry to intervene in it. Then her phone rang. She checked it with mild irritation, the irritation of someone whose performance has been interrupted at an inconvenient moment. Then she answered it, and I watched her face move through several expressions in approximately 90 seconds. The first was continued mild irritation at being called during dinner. The second was confusion as the content of the call registered. The third was something I had no precise word for in the moment. A kind of reconfiguration, the expression of someone whose internal map of a situation has just been handed a piece of geography that does not fit where she had placed it. She looked up at me, then looked away, then looked back, longer. The executive on the other end kept talking. I could not hear the words from across the table, but I knew the call because I knew my company and I knew the transaction, and I had known for 2 weeks that the financing approval for the Callaway Investment Group's coastal development rescue was sitting in my firm's authorization queue. I had signed it that morning, not as a move, not as a setup, as a routine business decision that had been proceeding through my company's normal review process for 6 weeks. The collision of timing was not my engineering, it was simply the world being indifferent to Vanessa Callaway's dinner party. Her voice when she finally spoke was not the voice she had been using all evening. "How?" she said. "How is this possible?" Nathan turned toward me with the expression of someone connecting pieces that had been sitting separately for too long. The table had gone completely still, and Vanessa was still holding the phone against her ear, looking at me across the candlelight with the specific expression of someone who has just understood that every word they said in the previous 2 hours was heard by exactly the wrong person. Not wrong because I would use it against her. Wrong because I had no need to. The room had heard it too, and rooms have better memories than people give them credit for. Vanessa set her phone down on the table with the careful precision of someone who needs a moment and is using an object to buy it. The executive on the other end had finished speaking. The call had ended, but the information it had delivered was still moving through the room the way a sound continues after the source has stopped, finding its way into every corner before the silence settles. Nathan was looking at me with an expression I had never seen from him before. Not surprise, exactly. More the specific expression of someone who has been holding a piece of a picture and has just been handed the frame and understood for the first time what the complete image shows. He said quietly, "Ellington Global is yours." It was not a question. I said yes. No elaboration, no performance of modesty or pride, just the confirmation, delivered in the same register I would use to confirm any straightforward fact. The table absorbed this in the specific way of a group of people processing information that requires them to simultaneously revise their understanding of the past 2 hours and decide how to behave going forward. Vanessa recovered first, or attempted to. She had spent 30 years in rooms where social recovery was a survival skill, and she deployed that skill now with the practiced speed of someone whose primary response to losing ground is to immediately begin reclaiming it. The tone shifted. The body language softened. She reached across the table and touched my arm and said, "Mara, I have to say, I had no idea. Nathan never mentioned." I said, "Nathan didn't know the full details until recently." She blinked, because that removed the deflection before she could fully construct it. She could not redirect toward Nathan's withholding if the withholding had been mine. Her husband Robert had been quiet for most of the evening in the specific way of someone who has learned that quietness is the safest position in proximity to his wife's social management. But he set his glass down now with a deliberateness that pulled attention and said, without looking at Vanessa, "You embarrassed this family tonight." Not loudly, 4 words in a conversational register, but the table heard every syllable. Vanessa's smile stayed on her face for approximately 2 seconds after the sentence landed, and then it left, and what replaced it was not hurt or shame, but the particular expression of someone who has just had their public image punctured in public and is calculating the damage in real time. Her sister found something very interesting on the far wall. The friends who had laughed at the refined comment were examining their dessert plates with sudden concentration. Nathan said, "Mom." She looked at him. He said, "Would you have spoken to her that way if you had known?" The question hung in the air with the specific weight of a question everyone in the room already knew the answer to and was waiting to see whether the person being asked would have the honesty to confirm it. Vanessa said, "That's not a fair question." Nathan said, "It's the only question." We left the restaurant at 10:15. The drive home was quiet in the way that quiet has texture when two people are each sitting with their own version of the same evening. Nathan drove. I looked at the passing streetlights and thought about Vanessa's face during the call and about the specific quality of a humiliation that arrives because you created the conditions for it yourself. He said, eventually, "How long have you known about the Callaway investment project?" I said, "The acquisition review came through our intake about 6 weeks ago. I recognized the project name from things you had mentioned about your family's investments. I recused myself from the initial review and had my operations director manage it through the standard process." He said, "But you signed the final approval." I said, "It came back to me for final authorization last week. The terms were sound. The restructuring made financial sense. I approved it on the merits." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You could have mentioned it." I said, "To whom?" "Your mother, to warn her that the woman she had been treating as insignificant was about to sign the paperwork keeping her investment group solvent, or to you so you could manage the information for her benefit." He thought about that. Then he said, "Neither." I said, "Exactly." He reached across and put his hand over mine briefly. He said, "I'm sorry about tonight." I said, "You didn't do anything tonight." He said, "I know. That's what I'm apologizing for." That was the moment I understood something about Nathan that I had suspected but not yet confirmed. He was not his mother's blind spot. He was someone who had spent years navigating proximity to her behavior and had developed the habit of apologizing for the weather because apologizing felt more manageable than addressing the climate. It was not weakness, it was the learned response of someone who grew up inside a particular system and had not yet fully understood that the system was optional. We were going to have that conversation, just not tonight. The following week, I went back to my office and did what I always did after significant events. I worked, not as avoidance, as the natural return to the thing that had always been the most honest part of my life. My office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Charleston with a view of the harbor that I had chosen specifically when I signed the lease 4 years earlier because I had grown up looking at water and found it easier to think near it. My operations director, a woman named Petra, who had been with me since the company's second year, brought me the updated Callaway restructuring file on Tuesday morning. She set it on my desk with the specific neutrality of someone who has heard something through professional channels and is waiting to see whether her employer wants to discuss it. I said, "You heard about the dinner." She said, "I heard about the dinner." I said, "It's handled." She said, "Is it?" I said, "The business side is handled. The personal side is its own timeline." She nodded and left the file and went back to her desk. The file confirmed what the phone call at the dinner table had outlined. The Callaway Investment Group's coastal development project had been carrying significant debt against assets that had underperformed their acquisition projections for 2 years. Without the restructuring capital my firm had approved, the project would have entered public default proceedings within the quarter. The default would have been visible to every social and professional contact the Callaway family maintained in Charleston. Vanessa had been sitting at that dinner table performing her assessment of my adequacy, while the financial mechanism preventing her family's public embarrassment was waiting for my signature. I had signed it before I walked into the restaurant. I thought about that occasionally in the days after the dinner, and each time I thought about it, I arrived at the same place, which was that the timing was not ironic. It was simply accurate. The world does not organize itself around people's performances of social hierarchy. It moves according to its own logic, and the collisions that result from that movement are not irony. They are just what happens when someone builds a map of the world based on what they wish were true rather than what is. The weeks following the engagement dinner produced a pattern I had expected but found clarifying to observe directly. Vanessa made 3 calls to mutual social contacts within the first 10 days. I knew this not through surveillance but through the specific efficiency of Charleston's old money social architecture, which transmits information through exactly the channels Vanessa thought she controlled. The calls were framed as clarifications. The dinner had been misunderstood. She had been speaking generally, not personally. The comments about background and accomplishment had been taken out of context by people who were perhaps being uncharitable in their interpretation. The clarifications produced the opposite of their intended effect. Because the people Vanessa called had already heard a different version from the dinner guest who had described the evening privately to 2 people who had each described it to 3 more. That is the specific mathematics of a story that has a satisfying irony at its center. It does not stay contained. The version circulating was accurate. A woman had publicly dismissed her future daughter-in-law as ordinary and background deficient at an engagement dinner. The phone call that arrived during that dinner had revealed that the daughter-in-law was the executive whose signature had just prevented the dismissive woman's family investment from collapsing. This was not a story that needed embellishment. It was complete as it stood. Vanessa's clarifications landed in a social environment that had already processed the original material and found it more interesting than the correction. Each clarification attempt confirmed that she was aware of the damage and was trying to manage it, which confirmed that the original story was accurate, which confirmed that the damage was real. She was, in the specific language of the world she had spent 30 years building a position in, a liability. Nathan and I had the conversation I had been holding in reserve 10 days after the dinner, not at his parents' house, at mine, on the balcony with coffee and the harbor visible in the early evening and the specific calm of a space that belonged entirely to me. I told him that I did not need him to manage his mother's behavior. I was not asking for intervention on my behalf. What I was asking for was clarity about what he believed our life together looked like and whether that life included the ongoing performance of deference to a hierarchy his mother had constructed around financial visibility and social positioning. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had valued about him from the beginning. Then he said, "I don't want that life." I said, "Then we need to build a different one." He said, "I know." I said, "Your mother is going to need to understand that what she did at that dinner is not something we move past by pretending it didn't happen." He said, "She won't apologize easily." I said, "I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for a change in behavior. Those are different things, and I've found it's worth being precise about which one you need." He looked at me for a moment with an expression that was something between recognition and relief. The expression of someone who has been waiting for a version of a conversation that had enough clarity to be useful. He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "To be present when I am in a room with your family, not defending me, just present, not leaving the room when things get uncomfortable, not apologizing for weather." He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." We sat with the harbor for a while after that. Meanwhile, Vanessa had a different problem developing, one that had nothing to do with the social repair she was attempting. 3 board members of the Callaway Investment Group had been in the restaurant the night of the engagement dinner, not at our table, at adjacent tables. 2 of them had heard enough to form their own assessment of the evening. The assessment they had formed was not about my feelings or Vanessa's social misstep. It was about judgment. Specifically, the judgment of a woman sitting on their advisory board who had publicly humiliated the executive whose signature was on their restructuring agreement at a dinner table while that executive was in the room. In investment circles, judgment is the most valuable and most fragile asset a board member carries. It is the basis on which every other contribution is evaluated. A person can be charming, connected, experienced, and still be considered a liability if the people around them cannot trust that she will read a room correctly before she speaks in it. The conversations that began among the 3 board members in the days after the dinner were not about loyalty or social politics. They were about risk management. And Vanessa, who had spent 30 years building a position in exactly this world, had no idea the assessment was happening. She was still focused on the social repair, while the professional consequences were already being decided in rooms she was not in. I did not know about those conversations yet, but I was about to. And what I learned when I found out would clarify something I had been wondering about since the night of the dinner, which was whether Vanessa's behavior had consequences only in the social world she valued, or whether it had reached the professional world she depended on. The answer was coming, and it was not arriving quietly. The board meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after the engagement dinner. I was not present. I had no seat on the Callaway Investment Group's advisory board and no standing to attend their internal proceedings. What I had was a restructuring agreement that gave Ellington Global Ventures oversight authority over certain financial decisions during the recovery period, and I had Petra, who managed our side of the restructuring relationship, and who called me at 4:17 that Thursday afternoon with the particular tone she used when something had resolved in a way worth noting. She said, "The Callaway board met today." I said, "I know." She said, "Vanessa's contract was terminated. Unanimous vote." I said nothing for a moment, not from surprise, from the particular quality of a moment that arrives exactly as anticipated and still carries weight when it lands. Petra said, "The official language is restructuring of advisory responsibilities. The private reason, which 3 people have now confirmed through separate channels, is conduct demonstrating poor judgment in relation to key investment relationships." I said, "Who moved the motion?" She said, "The same 3 board members who were in the restaurant that night." I thanked her and ended the call and sat at my desk with the harbor visible through the window and the afternoon light doing what afternoon light does in Charleston in the early weeks of spring, which is arrive at an angle that makes ordinary things look considered. Vanessa had not been removed because she insulted me. She had been removed because the people who made decisions about her professional future had watched her publicly humiliate the executive whose signature was on their rescue agreement and had concluded correctly that a person capable of that judgment in that room was a person whose judgment could not be trusted in any room. She had not lost her position because of my feelings. She had lost it because of her own behavior in front of witnesses who had the authority to act on what they saw. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Nathan told me about his conversation with her the following evening. He had called her after Petra's call reached him through his brother, who had heard from their father, who had been told by Vanessa herself in the specific way people announce consequences to family members when they need someone to absorb the shock of the information with them. Nathan said she had been composed on the phone, not tearful, not apologetic, composed in the way she was always composed when composure was the last instrument available. She said the board had made a political decision. She said certain members had been looking for an opportunity to restructure the advisory composition and had used the dinner as convenient pretext. She said none of it had anything to do with merit. Nathan listened to this and then said, "Mom, you called Mara ordinary at her own engagement dinner while she was sitting across the table from you, in front of people who sit on your board." Vanessa said, "I didn't know who she was." Nathan said, "That's exactly the problem." He told me later that the line had arrived before he finished deciding to say it, that it had simply been the true thing and had come out with the pressure of something that had been waiting for the right moment. He said Vanessa had been quiet for a long time after it. Then she said, "I would like to speak to Mara." Nathan said he would ask me. He asked me. I thought about it for less time than he expected. I said yes. She came to my office, not to my home, not to a neutral restaurant, not to her territory, to my office, which was my choice and which communicated something that did not need to be stated. She arrived on time, which I noted because punctuality in someone accustomed to making others wait is its own form of acknowledgement. Petra showed her in and closed the door. Vanessa sat across from my desk and looked around the office with the expression of someone recalibrating the physical environment against the mental map they had been using. The harbor view, the acquisition agreement on the wall, the quiet, ordered confidence of a space that had been built incrementally over years and had nothing to prove to anyone who walked into it. She said, "You have a beautiful office." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at her and waited. She said, "What I said at the dinner was wrong, not because of what I found out afterward, because it was wrong when I said it." She said that last sentence carefully, the careful placement of someone who understands that the quality of an apology depends on whether it addresses the actual offense or the consequences of the offense. Those are different apologies and they land differently. She was making the right one. I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "I have spent a long time believing that visible success was the only kind worth respecting. I understand that's a failure of character and not simply a social preference." I said, "It is." She looked at me steadily. She said, "Nathan loves you. I can see why." I said, "He's remarkable. You raised someone remarkable. That's real, regardless of the rest of this." Something shifted in her expression at that. Not collapse, not tears, something quieter. The expression of a person who has been braced for a harder landing and has encountered something unexpected in the quality of the ground. She said, "I don't expect you to forgive me immediately." I said, "I'm not interested in a performance of forgiveness. I'm interested in whether the behavior changes." She said, "It will." I said, "Then we have something to work with." We sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have said what needed to be said and are both deciding what comes next. Then she stood, thanked me for my time, and left. Petra appeared in the doorway 30 seconds after the elevator closed. She said, "How did that go?" I said, "Better than it needed to." She said, "Are you satisfied?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I'm clear," which is better than satisfied. The restructuring of the Callaway Investment Group concluded 4 months after the board meeting. The coastal development project stabilized under the new financial framework. 2 of the original board members rotated off and were replaced with appointments that better reflected the new investor composition. The project's revised timeline was more conservative than the original and more realistic, which meant it had a genuine chance of producing the returns it had originally promised. Ellington Global's oversight authority reduced proportionally as the recovery benchmarks were met, which was always the intended structure. My firm was not interested in permanent control of someone else's investment. We were interested in protecting our capital and ensuring the restructuring terms were honored. Both conditions were satisfied. I signed the reduction paperwork on a Tuesday morning and handed it to Petra and went back to the 3 other projects that had been waiting for my attention, while this one had occupied more of it than I had budgeted for. 3 months after the restructuring concluded, Nathan and I were married. The wedding was ours entirely, not a production, not a performance. A morning ceremony at a venue we had chosen together, attended by the people we had each chosen to have present, followed by a dinner that went until midnight because everyone at the table was someone worth staying late for. Vanessa attended. She was not the woman she had been at the engagement dinner, not transformed, not converted into someone she had never been, but different in the way people are different when a significant experience has genuinely reached them and they have chosen to let it change something real, rather than simply adjusting the performance. She sat beside Nathan's father during the ceremony, and I watched her from across the room at one point, and she was simply present, not managing the occasion, not curating it, just in it. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. 6 weeks after the wedding, the story of the engagement dinner had completed its circuit through Charleston's social networks and arrived at a kind of resting state. The version that persisted was accurate and simple. A woman had underestimated someone at a dinner table, and the phone call that interrupted the evening had corrected the misunderstanding in front of everyone present. The professional consequences had followed from the behavior rather than from any action on my part. The story was satisfying to people who heard it because it had the structure of something that resolved correctly. Vanessa's social calendar contracted in the months following her removal from the board. Not because people shunned her, because the confidence that had always animated her public presence had lost some of its certainty and the contraction was her own. She attended fewer events. The ones she attended she moved through differently, more quietly, more carefully, with less of the declarative energy that had always defined her presence in a room. Her husband told Nathan privately that he thought it was good for her. He said it was the first time in years he recognized her as the woman he had married before the social architecture had consumed most of her attention. Nathan told me this on an evening when we were sitting on our balcony with the harbor visible and the kind of quiet that settles after a long stretch of eventful months. I said, "That's a hopeful thing." He said, "I thought you'd find it satisfying." I said, "I find it real," which is different. He said, "What's the difference?" I said, "Satisfaction is about me. What's real is about her. I don't need it to be about me to appreciate that something changed." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You're going to be remarkable at this." I said, "At what?" He said, "At having a family." I looked at the harbor. I thought about a dining room full of candlelight and a champagne glass raised at the wrong angle, and a word that was meant to diminish and had instead illuminated ordinary. I had spent 12 years building something that could restructure a failing investment group with a signature. I drove my own car. I did not wear logos. I did not announce myself in rooms full of strangers. None of that was ordinary. All of it was mine. A woman raised a champagne glass at my engagement dinner and called me ordinary, while her family's investment group was waiting for my signature to survive the quarter. Her phone rang during that same dinner, and the executive on the other end explained my role clearly enough that the entire table heard it. The board members who witnessed her behavior concluded she was a liability and removed her from her advisory position 3 months later. She came to my office and delivered the kind of apology that addresses the actual offense rather than its consequences. The restructuring concluded successfully. Nathan and I were married. Vanessa contracted and then quietly became more honest. And her husband said it was the first time in years he recognized her. That is the whole story. Now here's what I want to leave with you. The people who need to announce their value loudly are often the people most afraid that the room will reach its own conclusion. The people who do not announce it have usually already decided that the room's conclusion is irrelevant to what they know about themselves. Vanessa needed visible markers to assess worth. The car, the logo, the family background, the socially legible credentials. In the absence of those markers, she defaulted to a category she had already decided existed for people like me. That category collapsed the moment a phone call provided the markers she recognized. But here is the thing worth sitting with. The markers were always there. The company existed before the dinner. The signature existed before the dinner. The 12 years of work existed before the dinner. None of it appeared or disappeared based on whether Vanessa knew about it. What changed was only her information. What did not change was the reality she had been misreading the entire time. You do not become more valuable when the people who underestimated you find out they were wrong. You were always that value. Their discovery of it is about them, not you. Tell me in the comments your first name and your city, and tell me whether you have ever been placed in a category by someone who stopped looking before they finished seeing you. I want to know what that felt like, and whether you let them keep the wrong version. Subscribe to Revenge Cold Stories if you want to be here for the next one. The next story starts the way all the real ones do, with someone deciding that a person's worth is already determined, right before they find out how wrong they were.